All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Aswin Punathambekar. I'm at the moment in Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. And with me are my two wonderful co-authors, Amanda Lotz at Queensland in Brisbane, and Dan Herbert in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. And we just wanted to begin by thanking all of you for joining us across various time zones, including some really lovely friends who
No.
on the West Coast at 4 in the
And I've
morning.
already finished. So I finished 40 minutes early.
Right.
Έχεις τίποτα άλλο στη μουσική, τίποτα άλλο που έχεις να κάνεις catch-up με τα άλλα?
So if I could, I can start by requesting everybody logged on to please go ahead and hit mute. And I will. All right, here we go. All right, so again, thank you. Welcome to everybody joining in from various time zones. And we also wanted to kick things off by thanking our lovely team from Politique Press for helping us set this up, to the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, our friends and colleagues in that association, and various divisions in the ICA, the International Communication Association, for helping us spread the word and getting this going. So the three of us thought we'd follow a straightforward sort of format for today. We'll begin with a story about how the book came about, how our teaching and our work with graduate students in particular shaped the book, why we decided to organize the book the way we did, intellectual history, followed by a brief discussion about the levels. And finally, we'll just take two chapters. We'll focus on two chapters of the book as a way to offer a slightly more grounded sense of some of the challenges we faced, the complexities we had to deal with in organizing a book like this, and of course, the potential for media industry studies to shed light on some of the major concerns of our time: culture, capital, circulation, keywords at that register. And we'll do our best to wrap this up in about 30 to 40 minutes and then address questions, comments, suggestions, and so on. And for the Q&A session, or even just comments and suggestions, please do feel free to use the raise my hand feature in your Zoom windows. But given the number of people present here, it might be easiest and best if you would send us questions through the chat window. That way, given the number of people, I'm guessing there will be some questions that we might be able to group together in interesting ways instead of going through each raised hand. And I might miss, because I'm now into multiple pages, so I might very easily miss anybody who's raising their hand on Zoom. So again, thank you for joining us and welcome. And to kick things off, I'm going to turn this over to Amanda Lotz, who'll begin with a narrative about how the book came about.
Yeah, it was good to think back. I had to go back and check some dates and sort of sort out how this had happened. But I think it very much grew out of conversations between Dan and I. At Michigan, whatever your department's called, Dan, now, what was then Screen Arts and Cultures on the 6th floor, and where Aswin and I in communication studies, we were on the 5th floor. And we came to collectively have this identity of the 5th and a half floor, and sort of this group of scholars who fit somewhere in between the department. And Dan and I were trading a course back and forth at the graduate level on understanding media industries and sort of talking about what we were including there. And Dan was on leave, and so I needed to teach a class, sort of a theory version of that class in screen arts. And I think that created a number of conversations as well, because we were cycling back through, in many cases for me, literature I hadn't read in 10, 15 years, and talking about how it was relevant. And so it was often in the context of what are we teaching in that class and why. And I think also sort of as the three of us started to show up consistently on the same graduate student committees, several of which I'm glad to see on here today. And you know, we're talking with those students about the projects, and often sort of running into these same questions about how do you do your, how do you narrow that project? Or you want to talk about this topic, but what aspect of it? And sort of that process, I think, of collectively working with students, trying to refine their questions, created reflection on our part about our practice. Dan and Aswin trained just a little bit after me. And so I think they had more actual industry studies in their training. I had none. And so sort of thinking back as to how we had pieced things together in our training just a little bit apart. And you know, I think we just got curious about a story. And then I think the other thing that happened was Dan and I were involved in a collaboration of looking at how digitization changed multiple media industries. And so I was coming at it from television, Dan from film, and then Lee Marshall was looking at music. And I remember just clearly this moment talking with Lee and sort of asking him, you know, what he thought of media industry studies. And he looked at us sort of strangely like, what are you talking about? And sort of the realization that in different industries, you know, there wasn't the same sense of study. And sure enough, you know, popular music had its own history and industry was a part of it. And journalism wasn't represented in the room that day, but the same thing could be said of journalism, that there's very discrete journalism studies and industry studies are just part of that. And I think related to some of the work that Dan and I were trying to do, sorting out what can different industries learn from each other, the questions that slowly came together in the book started to come up, and the notion as well that not that the world needed another book, but that there really wasn't a good text to send students to help them refine their topics, and to really think about their questions and to think about all of the different ways that they can answer their questions. And so that was something that I think we thought could be a book. And from there, I mean, the logic of the book was harder because I think we knew far more what we didn't want to do than what we did want to do. I particularly did not want to do an overview of key works at all. That just, I knew there was already too much in the field and I didn't want to have to narrow. In fact, I wanted to try and push out the boundaries of what we often thought of as media industry studies. So as long as it wasn't any kind of overview of key works, you know, I was okay with it. But then, you know, we also wanted it to be about multiple media industries and not just audiovisual industries. And we didn't want to structure it as a lot of media economics books are, sort of by industry, by chapter. So that took that possible organization out. And we wanted to have a historical sense, but we also didn't want the entire book to be chronological. We wanted it to be, to represent international and global context, but we also, again, didn't want that kind of an organization where Section 1, North America, Section 2, Europe, Section 3, Asia, and so on. So we started to kind of run out of ways to organize things. And we also wanted it to include work that might not have thought of itself and still might not think of itself as media industries, but we wanted to recognize the key works that had been important in our own thinking, in our own projects, even if it had been done in sociology or anthropology and fields outside of media and communication. So, and it was, I think, Dan, or at least Dan's claiming it, who thought that the scales that Horace Newcomb and I had used in an older article actually could be an effective way simply to organize the book. And I think we tried to put in a lot of language around the idea that like this wasn't some sort of like crucial framework or anything like that. It was more that we just needed a heuristic to organize the book. And it gave us a way to talk across media industries. It gave us a way to blend studies of media industries in different places. And so I think it was very clear that of all those options, it was the one that solved the most of our problems. So I will now segue delicately to Aswin, who hopefully is ready to talk now about the challenges or the questions that we debated in terms of defining industry in all of this.
I think one of the first things we recognized was that we need to be careful not to define the term industry too narrowly or based on any one particular discipline's notion of what counted as an industry. So very early in the book, we take our cue from scholars including John Caldwell as well as Nitin Govil, who in an In Focus piece in the Cinema Journal a few years ago, wrote some really provocative and polemical pieces, sort of suggesting that any account of what an industry might be from any given part of the world has to be thought about in a very contingent sort of manner. And that then led us to thinking about how best to situate ourselves. And given our particular backgrounds, given the fact that we all identified very much as media and cultural studies scholars, we turned to Michelle Helms. And Michelle Helms, in a recent book, has this very clear sort of definition of what she thinks media studies can and should be. And she says, and this is from page 6 of the book, where she says, it's really quite simply centered on the critical analysis of texts, not texts in isolation, but as they are produced by industries and institutions and received by audiences and societies. So we sort of took that and said, within this very capacious understanding of a critical, humanistically based media studies, where might media industry studies be situated? So we followed that lead in taking a very broad understanding of both, in quotes, media and in quotes, industry, and decided to then do our very expansive review of existing scholarship and tried our best to then go out of our comfort zones to bring in voices, to bring in scholarly exemplars that would push the boundaries of these objects of study. And here, this is probably the best place for me to shout out to a graduate student that we all continue to work with, Ray Moores, who did an absolutely outstanding job of not only giving us help with the scholarship, but also really pushing us to rethink our own assumptions, which are in interesting ways very generationally specific in terms of when we go through certain kinds of graduate programs and so on. And that really helped the process as well. And Dan, do you want to then talk a little bit about levels and how we went about doing the lit review?
Yeah, excuse me. Thanks, Aswin. And thanks again to everybody for joining us. So yeah, I did advocate for the levels schema, in part because, you know, Amanda had already published extensively in media industry. So as I was coming in and teaching it at the undergrad and occasionally at the grad level, I was using that essay that she'd written with Horace Newcomb, and just to get my students to think about projects for their final semester paper, right? And again, it wasn't like I was with the students saying, this is the way to organize, but it might get you going, right? And so, and I think really it was in some ways, so I was inspired by that essay, and it seemed it could be adjusted given the length of the book was going to be short. It gave us a nice way of saying, okay, we can organize things this way. And that would eradicate or eliminate all of the other bad organizational principles that we were avoiding, right? By geography or by industry or by chronology. So it really was by default. Now, nevertheless, we found, and this is something that I'll talk about a bit later, that, you know, once you do have that kind of grid, it is an imposition on scholarship to kind of force it to conform to this new schema that the original authors did not necessarily intend. So in some ways, you know, we were saying, well, does that, like, I like this book, I think it's really good, does it fit at that, what scale is that, right? So now it's about finding examples that fit to this almost artificial organization that we introduced. But beyond that, I think, you know, our desires were to, and Amanda pointed to some of this, find examples that were from multiple media, because I think we really wanted to show readers that one could learn methodology for film study by reading a book about journalism, or one could read, you know, learn about research questions from music industry that could be applied to television, right? So we really wanted to show the range of scales, but also like how research questions lined up with scales or didn't, and that the industry was almost inconsequential, almost. Because the other thing we wanted to show is, as Amanda said, right, examples from a wide range of geographic contexts. And so, you know, where, you know, it's very easy for me to write about an American film studio, right? And then Aswin would jump in and write about the Madras Studios book. And so we could find from our own bibliographies up here wide-ranging examples. And along those lines, and not to put too fine a point on it, not just books from a wide range of geographic contexts, but I think we were also at least unconsciously looking for works written by a range of different authors, right, from different social backgrounds and identities, that we didn't want to kind of reiterate a kind of white male UK US media industries, or we wanted to like push that to the side as much as possible. And so part of our bibliography was also saying, hey, we need to read widely, and that means diversifying your bibliography if you haven't already done so.
Dan, before Amanda jumps into the intellectual history, I realized we didn't really circulate a table of contents. So very quickly, when we're talking about scales, here's the breakdown. So the book begins with sort of chapter 1 is it narrates an origin story of media industry studies. And from there, it just goes quite in a straightforward way. Chapter 2 is about individuals and roles. Chapter 3 gets into production cultures. Chapter 4 then scales up to organizations. Chapter 5 gets into industries and practices. And finally, chapter 6, which I'll talk a little bit about today, gets into the macro political economy level of thinking about industries and institutions. So it's this neat progression, but it's anything but neat internally. It's quite messy, as Dan has been suggesting. So,
Yeah, and so I think in the end, that those were some of the impulses that drove the selection. It's certainly not a kind of greatest hits necessarily. It's just what we thought was nicely representative of either a work that conformed to a certain scale, or a work that highlighted a specific geographic region, or a work that highlighted an industry particularly well, because we certainly wanted the chapters examples to be wide-ranging in all of those different ways. I think I was re-looking at, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, I was re-looking at the organizations chapter, which I think actually is fairly well balanced in terms of who wrote it. We all took active roles in the whole book, but some chapters are more one person than another. But chapter 4, the organizations, is pretty equally representative. But at the end, in italics, I think this is Amanda's line, she writes, media industry research is often more valuably categorized by the underlying question than by the topic. And I think that was one of our real criteria in terms of choosing it, is like, first, does it fit the scale? Because now that's the organization of the book. But then, does the book raise a really good research question and pursue that question through an innovative and illuminating methodology? So that's kind of how we put it together. And each of us would say, how about this book? How about that book? And through kind of checks and balances of the three of us, we came up with the kind of list of authors and books that we discussed in the book. Now I'll send it back over to Amanda, talking about the intellectual history chapter.
Yeah, so contrary to, what we didn't want for the whole book was a chronological slog through time of great works of media industry studies, but we did want to try to start a narrative of a history, because we didn't feel like there was much of an existing origin story. We all felt that we had lived through it to some degree, or at least lived through the moment in which something coalesced. 2009, we were just insistent, like something happened and around then, and we wanted to go back and sort of figure out where it had come from. And so, sort of by virtue of the different training that we each received, we had a slightly different lens on what that history was. And so I'm not sure that it comes through particularly strongly in the book, but we did do a fair bit of oral histories with some of the folks that were writing in the 70s and 80s, and just sort of talking about, like, I know you didn't think that what you were doing was media industry studies, but why did you start studying the mode of production in film? That was my question for Janet Steiger, and I talked to Michelle Hilms earlier, sort of asking, for her memory, as you were going through graduate school, where would you have pointed to the key industry studies work, and kind of tracing those intellectual genealogies in terms of who trained with who. And the conversation I had with Janet was really helpful. And I think it really was an aha moment in terms of I knew from my own much more extensive reading of the British political economy work, it was obvious that sort of the 60s, 1968 in particular, had a clear impact there. And I also knew that to be very important in terms of the founding of cultural studies. But to hear her talking about how those events were important in terms of shifting the things that she wanted to focus on in studying film was sort of like, okay, that you really had these three different intellectual trajectories, and yet this one moment that was inspiring them in different ways, but that it really put together a narrative of how in moments of profound uncertainty and change, perhaps like we know now, you are looking at not just the media texts themselves, but you're looking at the institutions perhaps more closely than you do at other times. So that also was part of that, the background of trying to build that story. And again, I think we were coming at it through three sets of eyes, sets of eyes trained in the US system. And so, I think while we tried to tell a broad story, I think that chapter is particularly US and UK centric. And so I think we're hopeful that that narrative and those key texts can be discussed more extensively and fleshed out in discussions as the field or subfield or discipline or whatever it is further coheres in coming years.
So yeah, I think now we can just move on to talking about chapters. I'm going to be very brief because, in fact, I was talking already about the organization chapters, the organizations chapter. And I guess the thing that I wanted to highlight about that, because Aswin's going to talk about the macro view chapter as being difficult. In some ways, right, when we came upon the organizations chapter, it was in some ways, the simplest to approach, because so many books and articles do take on a specific media institution as their kind of topic, right, or as their primary object of analysis. And so what was important there is, again, as with the whole book, right, that we could represent multiple media. So in that chapter, there's a section about film studios, there's a section about news organizations, and then there's a section about music labels. And so not all of them are, like in the music labels section, right, it's a bit of saying, well, this book might not have thought of itself as doing this. And in fact, this book might slip out of this scale at important points, but it really does grab onto the music label as an important institution as a fundamental part of the organization. In addition, what I like about that chapter, because I certainly was not trained in the communications department, and so journalism is well outside of my training, and so to have Amanda really contribute those books, studies of the BBC and books about how digital technologies have transformed newsrooms, that seemed like a really key element to include, both because it pushed at least me from a film studies background to look at books that I might not have otherwise looked at, but the questions and the methods are things that I feel really invested in. So like, how does a technological change an industry, right? You could have easily picked a book about the transition in cinema from silence to synchronous sound, right? To kind of come up with similar kinds of questions and problems. But to ask in a book about how does digital technology change journalism, that can inspire film studies scholars or television studies scholars in many ways. For me, I took on most heavily the passages about the Tino Ballio books about United Artists and Alyssa Perrin's book about Miramax. And what, I guess, just to end my little section here, like what really was important for me is that not only do those books take a film studio as their focus, but both highlighted different sources of information and different historical spans, right? So whereas Tino Ballio's book is based on archival primary documents held within the studio system, so internal documents that we don't have access to for something like, say, Disney right now. I thought that was really important to highlight somebody who got down into the archive. Whereas Alyssa's book is based entirely on publicly available materials, not interviews, not behind the scenes kind of documents. So I thought that, and yet it's still a good book that tells a good story and has good analyses, right? So just kind of juxtaposing those things. And the other difference being that whereas Tino's book covers many decades, Alyssa's book is about one decade in particular. And so just showing how, on the one hand, there's Balio's book has this kind of sweeping historical narrative, whereas Alyssa's book, each chapter has these kind of tight, deep dives into specific analyses of specific marketing strategies. So those kinds of balancing acts are the things that we tried in that chapter. And I think, in the end, like I said, I think each of us wrote that one in fair equal measure. And it's representative. You guys can have plenty of criticisms of it, but at least to us, I think it's representative of what we tried to do from the start. But now Aswin can talk about trickier chapters. You're muted, Aswin.
So even within the organization's chapter, right? So when I needed to chip in and add my contribution, even within a particular national context that gets overrepresented within the media studies, I could have gone to a study of a Bombay film studio, but I consciously sort of tried to move out of that national context and look for perhaps a regional situation. So I ended up going to Swarnavel Pillai's really crucial historical account of film studios in South India as a way to unsettle both our thinking about national film studios, national cinemas, and regional cinemas in relation to the dynamics and the politics of global academia. So that's sort of one of the things we kept in mind in each chapter as we went through and picked exemplars of scholarly work. So my goal was simply to talk a little bit about the macro chapter, in part because this was tricky, but we also had great fun developing this chapter. Because we didn't want to slide into simply suggesting that a macro view would amount to little more than a rehearsal of a political economy account that we're all familiar with. So, think Herbert Schiller and claims about media and cultural imperialism. We wanted to avoid caricaturing those macro world system level arguments and take a deeper dive into it. And as it turned out, revisiting this strand of scholarship within media studies ended up revealing for us a terrain that was actually far more nuanced and full of interesting twists and turns than I think we've done with credit. And what we really enjoyed was discovering voices that simply haven't registered in mainstream understandings of a critical political economy approach. Right? So the chapter, we open it with revisiting a debate that unfolded in Open Democracy and Online Forum about media ownership, concentration, and the impact that has on liberal democratic politics. And as we delved into the many articles in that debate, what became clear was the approaches and the theoretical frameworks aside, what remains crucial is one enduring question about the role of media within a predominantly capitalist order in shaping the cultural foundations for democratic politics. And so hanging on to that question proved really helpful instead of just worrying about this particular scholarly sort of trend or so on. And that became useful for us as we wrote the chapter. So as I went and reread the chapter in preparation for this, I came away with 3 points, and Dan and Amanda, please chime in if you want to add other things. The first thing we realized was, despite all our talk about transnational sort of flows and so on, we realized that national and regional contexts continue to matter in profoundly important ways. Again, I'm stating the obvious here, but bear with me. So take the debate about media imperialism, for example. If all we ever do is gesture to Herbert Schiller's early work and then move straight and slide into 80s and 90s cultural studies, it'll do us no good. So we discovered that as early as 1977, Latin American scholars were writing in more nuanced ways about dependency by thinking in regionally specific ways. We also discovered that in the UK, a scholar called Rita Cruz O'Brien, not someone we read and teach widely, published an article in 1979 that explored institutional dynamics, for example, pricing, technical standards, media training, and so on, through which British norms were being taken up in newly independent post-colonial nations across Africa. Right? And one of the things worth pointing out is the political economy, more than any other subfield, seems gendered in a very particular way. It's not as if voices aren't there, but we seem to have gendered it through our practices of reading and citation. And it's something that it really struck us, and we hope to have pushed that in some new ways. The second the second insight we came away with is that texts matter, even from a political economy, macro level perspective. And by that, I mean that when we move into the 1990s, an era marked by neoliberal market reforms really across the world, Toby Miller and his co-authors Global Hollywood looms really large as a key text, right? But one of the co-authors of that 2-volume set, Nitin Govill, offers a way to think about global media flows in a much more historically grounded and comparative way. And what Govill does is he shows us that media hierarchies are established and worked out as much as in textual practices. So he talks a lot about copying and remaking, for example, as much as through state policy or divisions of cultural labor. So that focus on texts and textual readings remains crucial even in this macro level perspective. And the third insight for us was that medium specificity matters. And Dan has spoken about this a little bit in the organizations chapter as well. So in thinking at a macro level, we turn to scholars like Bernard Miege, who identifies different logics at work based on industries that might follow a particular model. He called, for example, one of the things he talks about is an editorial model. And he does that and contrasts that to something like a flow model. And in identifying those kinds of models and logics, he is able to make claims about industry structures and practices that are both specific to a medium, but that can actually cut across industries. And this again goes to Amanda's early sort of point that one of the goals in this book was for us to see, and like Dan said, what might we take away from a study of the BBC that Philip Schlesinger did in the late 1970s? What might that tell us about studying, let's say, a digital platform company at this point in time? So to really move across terrains of the media and cultural industries as we know it, and then open up our perspective to new questions that at this point, really, it's graduate students and early career scholars that their forthcoming books and articles and so on that we're looking forward to in terms of moving this conversation forward. So I think we're going to stop there in terms of talking about the book. And then we have two final notes. Over to Amanda to quickly sort of tell us a little bit about the limits and gaps that we sort of still feel haunt this book. As in some ways, it's an impossible task. We're all very nervous, to be perfectly honest, about this being out in the world. So Amanda will talk just for 2 minutes about limits and gaps. And finally, we also wanted to talk about the writing process, about collaborative work.
Yeah, I started by sort of enumerating all of our goals, and we kind of did them. I mean, I think we were certainly mindful of them as goals. It's still pretty audiovisual heavy. I think by the end, I think what was challenging is when we got frustrated, or when we needed something, sort of most of our collective memories of scholarship were audiovisual. And so those are definitely overrepresented, as is the US and the UK. There's no two ways around that. So I think those were both challenges, and Aswin notes, I think we're very much eagerly looking for the next generation of scholars who hopefully will continue to publish work that pushes those boundaries and gives us more case studies to look in other places at how these questions can be answered, and hopefully decrease the kind of focus of the same old usual suspects that we've relied on in some places here. Dan?
I think that the other thing that I would say is that obviously the transformations rendered by the digital transformation, digital disruption are, that's new ground that needs to be explored and better analyzed, but it's still in formation now in terms of the literature. I also think that one of the things I've seen is that there's more concerted scholarship that's more concertedly interested in issues of social identity and social justice as related to the media industries. And although we discuss some of that work in the book, I think that's become a kind of identifiable strain within media industry studies. So it's not just that people say are interested in gender and sexuality or race, but rather, how do industry and things like race get put together or mashed up, and or how can you think about these things simultaneously? How must we think about these things simultaneously? So those are the things that I would say are at the kind of cutting edge that our book doesn't get into enough of, just because I think a lot of that good stuff is still being written right now, although Aswin might have other things to say.
No, I think in the interest of time, and I'm sure there are lots of questions, we should probably wrap this up. But one final note on the collaborative process. So in the last stages before the manuscript was due, we of course had a mad rush to sort of as closely as possible stylistically sort of line our prose up in relation to each other. And during the last about 6 to 8 weeks, we were operating across 3 different time zones, which turned out to be a good thing because if I remember right, Dan would sign off for the day, hand it over to me. I would then sign it off and hand it over to Amanda in Australia, and then back to Dan by the time it was 7 in the morning or something like that. But we just wanted to bring this up to say that it was incredibly fun, intellectually rewarding. Depending on the project, it can be fast. And most importantly, we wanted to suggest that this kind of collaborative work and different kinds of projects is really crucial for us to do and to model for emerging generations of scholars, especially so in this, on the more critical humanities side of the field. We really can learn a lot from our colleagues in the social sciences and the more quantitative social sciences, where this is part of the course, and try and develop ways to do collaborative work and not fetishize the single authored sort of work, given the changes that we are seeing unfold in the academy at large across the world. So we just wanted to put in a plug for collaborative work before we wrap up and take questions. And thank you all for listening. Dan and Amanda, any last words?
No, you said the collaborative thing just right, so thank you.
Right, so like we said, please raise, many hands going up. I'm going to, I think, try my best to sort of moderate this. And I'll keep a running tab of names as I see names going up. But please also go to the chat window. Amanda and Dan, can I depute you to look at the chat window while I
Sure.
see the hands being raised? All right, so I have 2 hands straight away. The first from Caitlin and then second from Yuval. So Caitlin, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just really curious what kind of institutional support you guys were able to arrange for a collaborative project.
Very little. I think when we talk about the 5th and a half floor, I mean, I that was really important for me because I was the odd man out. Aswin and Amanda were officially in comm, and I was this film guy who didn't always feel like a film guy. And so, yeah, the collaborative, since I would say 2014, when I published my monograph and got tenure, I've almost only done collaborative works. And part of that is because Amanda and Aswin have been so intellectually exciting, and we all have an interest in hanging out with each other. And when you're hanging out with really smart people and you start batting around ideas, you say, well, why don't we just write that? And so there's this really organic way that multiple collaborative projects have happened in this building where we all used to be located in Ann Arbor, and say, well, let's do an article. And then, is that a book scaled project? And then it would be more conversations and more breakfasts. And then the writing process, of course, with each collaborative project is very different because each person is a different writer. But I think that the research was pretty organic in terms of honestly just being conversations in the hallway among friends who have shared interests. But no, I mean, you can correct me, Amanda, was there any support? I mean, okay, there's one exception to that. We had a thing that Amanda put together called the Media Studies Research Workshop. And it's a collective of students and faculty, both from all over, but mostly comm and FTBM, that meet on a regular basis, semi-regular basis, to just talk about in a very low stakes, open way. You can, say terrible, stupid things, and there's no problem. So that was something again that Amanda invented, and that she and some grad students kind of found support and forced it to work. But otherwise, no, there was no support.
Yeah, I would say the Media Studies Research Workshop, but also that's a really great question, I guess, to think a little bit about, Caitlin, from your position as an editor of Journal of Cinema and Media Studies too. One thing we'll say is, while we didn't have any institutional support per se from our, at the time, our common home institution, we did do small things like take half a day when we all attended the ICA conference in Washington, DC, to have a small writing session, brainstorming session. So I think there are creative ways in which humanities scholars can do this, where we can repurpose meetings that we go to as a way to talk through things and just take half a day to do that. And then hopefully that will also model something for graduate students and other scholars who are figuring out how best to survive and thrive in the academy at this point in time.
We have a question on the chat from Catherine. She's asked us to talk more about the range of methods that we found in the studies that we use. Are there particular methods for specific industries and or different parts of the world? Would you recommend that scholars of various industries, TV, journalism, etc., could look to studies of other industries to enrich their scholarship and region? Either of you want to start on that?
Dan, do you just want to speak from the organizations chapter since we mentioned it?
Yeah, sure. The organizations chapter, right, like I said, has values a book which is based on this amazing archive of primary documents from behind the scenes at United Artists. Alyssa's book, the Schlesinger book on the BBC, where he hung out at the BBC and interviewed over 100 people. And then I forget which book it was, but you know, then some books that don't even declare their methods precisely, but it's clear that they were doing interviews and field work in addition to all sorts of secondary research. And so, but I think, you know, but Catherine's question about, like, would we recommend that scholars of various industries look to studies of other industries? I think that's one of the implicit arguments of this book, that it's not just recommended but necessary that we read beyond our medium of choice or our industry of specialization, because you will always find some methodological innovation or some kind of little tidbit in terms of sources of data or how to investigate data, right? Like, so I think, like, that chapter, you know, the organization chapter has primary sources, secondary sources, fieldwork, and interviews across music, cinema, and newspapers. And so in that way, it's really, again, representative of, I think, our goals to be, like, to say, you want to study Facebook, here's a number of ways that you could tear Facebook apart or to poke at Facebook, or and if you have access to this kind of information, great, you could probably write this kind of story about Facebook. If you can get this kind of access, then you could write this other kind of analysis. It's really up to your creativity and your I don't know, detective work. I hope that answers Catherine's question. It's a smart question.
I think at one point we talked about whether method was a way to organize.
We did.
And it kind of came down to, and to put it bluntly, there's really two kinds of information across the chapters. You either get evidence from humans or you get evidence from texts. And so those humans could be interviews, they could be observations, they could, we don't use them particularly, but they could be something like surveys. Or you're looking at trade press and other sorts of written archives. And so I think if anything became clear was that the methods were very similar across every chapter. And so, but I think the key is, and your question hints at this, is the need for the question, the research question and the method to really align well. And so, you know, that's really, the crucial bit is not the topic. I want to study YouTube or Facebook or Disney, but what about it? And then figuring out, you know, can your question even be answered by the methods that are available, and really fine tuning from there to make those things connect up well.
So I'm going to try and respond to Catherine's question about connecting the question of methods to specific regions and whether there are crucial variations. So I'll start from, I guess, an intellectual history kind of vantage point to say that let's just stick to the US context for the moment and then broaden out. Given the formation of specific kinds of subfields in this context, I think what we did notice was ways that the methods shifted both in terms of time period and in terms of the formation. So film studies, for instance, had some very well-established ideas about what counts as valid and crucial methods to deploy for a long time, until the early 90s, when media studies, cultural studies meets the ethnographic turn across the humanities and the social sciences, where suddenly you see new kinds of methods burst onto the scene that Julie Daci, for instance, captures so well in her essay in the Television After TV book on the circuit of culture and its many iterations over time. But that said, if I were to move this to, let's say, the South Asian context, that kind of neat decade by decade sort of transition, both in terms of media transition, theoretical and methodological shifts, do not line up as well. Given that film studies gets institutionalized quite late in the game, in the South Asian context, while at the same time, students coming into these film studies programs are already beginning to study other kinds of digital media, all kinds of sort of media objects that are proliferating at this point, then those methodological sort of differences really vanish quite quickly. But that said, even across this regional sort of differences, I think it's fair to say that, like Amanda said, the single biggest thing we took away from our survey of the scholarship is that the best work treats every kind of evidence as a layer of text to be analyzed, regardless of what that evidence might be, even if you get it from people, let's say participant observation and so on. Whatever notes that one might write about it at the end of the day, it becomes another layer of text to be interpreted and to not, and as Catherine, as you yourself would say in your classes, not to be taken at face value. But I'm going to sort of use my moderator's privilege here to actually ask Catherine, who's one of the best thinkers on qualitative research methods, if I may, Catherine, to ask you to actually chime in and tell us a little bit about how your own thinking has evolved, given that you wrote one of the first key books about about bringing together media industry studies with questions of identity, representation, and queer studies.
Good morning, everybody. You've put me on the spot. Let's just say I'm not.
It's early where you are.
I'm not fit to be seen, but well, firstly, I'd just like to say how much I'm really enjoying this conversation and how good it is to see friends and former colleagues, and how much I miss you. So that's one thing to say. So yeah, I did my PhD dissertation into a book. So I started that research in the mid-90s, and I didn't know that there was anything or was going to be anything called media industry studies then, but so I feel like that's sort of what I was doing. And at that point, as much as anything, I was drawing on a kind of sociological history of the construction of the art world, and some early pieces by like an excellent book by Barry Dornfeld on PBS, creating a PBS documentary series. So there was some really wonderful early exemplars, but they were very scattered. It felt very scattered. So it's really interesting to see how this area is kind of coalescing. And I guess in terms of the relationship between identity and cultural production, as I was thinking of it then, was that I wasn't really interested in looking at simply at how people who were involved in gay marketing, which was the topic of the book, were simply reproducing images of gay and lesbian people, very rarely bisexual or transgender people, in advertising or in marketing campaigns. I was really interested in looking at how, on the one hand, sort of ideas about sexuality were forming how to produce that market, but also how marketers were in turn reforming what it meant to be a gay or a lesbian person. So it was the kind of so basically the question was, if sexuality is culturally constructed and if markets are culturally constructed, how do we think about the mutual constitution of the gay market, rather than saying there is a gay person, how do we market to them, or there's this pre-existing market and we can just produce advertising. So that was the conundrum that I was really interested in looking at.
Can I be very clear right now and to say that Catherine Sender is also a member of the 5th and a Half Floor? So, I mean, so she's kind of a ringer here because she's been part of these conversations, or the 5th and a Half Floor conversations, for many years. So, thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, and sorry to put you on the spot there, but I knew you would have something to say on this.
That's the thing. We knew she could be put on the spot.
And I might call on one or two other people too.
Shriram posted a question.
Yeah, so I'm getting to Shriram's question. Shriram Mohan is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and his question speaks to one of the limitations of the book that hopefully will get addressed down the road, which is, given the digital transition and given that tech giants like Facebook and Google are very slippery objects or institutions, in the sense that they make claims about being a media company when they choose to or when it suits their needs, and at other times vehemently deny it and raise the flag of being a tech company. So how do we negotiate this slipperiness between technology stroke media is something that I think several members of the Media Studies Research Workshop who used to be at Michigan have grappled with, including Amanda herself. And yeah, we can speak to that very quickly. But Shriram, perhaps you yourself could say a little bit, given that you bring STS scholarship into your own work in media studies. And that's really the interface at which I think we need to operate to deal with these digital companies. Amanda, do you want to take this question about tech stroke media?
Sure. I mean, I think I don't really care what they call themselves, right? They're cultural and economic institutions, and it doesn't really matter. So I think, in many ways, it comes back to what is the question you want to investigate, right? There's so many people right now researching Facebook and Twitter in all kinds of ways. Most of it's focused on use. A lot of it's sort of focused on, sort of information that can be gathered based on the constant flow of content being produced there. And so I think it's really crucial that we figure out what are the industrial questions to ask, and to be looking at the ways in which something like the fact that these are ad-supported media entities, in many ways they are phenomenally like the broadcast advertising that we know very well. And to instead of thinking that they're just some sort of foreign thing that requires entirely new frameworks, to actually take a lot of what we already know about companies that sell attention, and how, when you're a company that sells attention, you behave in certain ways, and then theorizing and explaining the difference between when you actually have to create your own content versus when people create it for you for free. And so I think what I still see missing in a lot of that scholarship is that sort of foundational work that is that a lot of the more popular, perhaps, questions then really can play into. But without that foundation, I think it's difficult to dig into something like content moderation, let's say, because what these companies are doing in terms of content moderation, in many ways, it ties back to what are their corporate priorities and why. And so I don't think they're that different. I think they are merely other media institutions to study. A lot of what might be called digital or social media doesn't figure prominently in the book, largely because we were looking primarily for work that had been around a little while. For the most part, we weren't trying to include the most recent publications. So I think the conversation we had repeatedly was, well, we'll put it in the second edition. So if Polity's willing.
Yeah, very quickly, one of the things that has come up in some of the work that I've been doing in the South Asian context, and Shriram Mohan has been part of it too, is the need to, as we move forward, especially in the digital mode, is to think not just in terms of intermediality, which we can do with your likes of, say, online streaming and so on, film, television, etc., but also to think very carefully in terms of intersectoral connections. So the fact that we need to take telecommunications seriously as an institutional player in relation to, let's say, streaming video in different markets around the world. Sriram, do you want to quickly weigh in before we have two more questions, one from you Wildcats and one from Amanda, a third one actually. So if you have something quick to say.
No, that was great. Thank you. That I just wanted to think about the stakes of thinking through media companies as or tech companies as media companies, and sometimes I think the slipperiness is also a function, even as a metaphor, that them being slippery objects is because they're such unwieldy objects. To talk about Facebook, for instance, you know, I'll be talking about Facebook's audiovisual productions for Facebook Watch, which then I think is more readily accessible to a media industry's approach than to something else like you know, their troubles with regulators. Right? These are things that I think a media industry's approach, you know, more readily sort of helps us access. I was wondering if some of the more harder to reach parts, like Amanda mentioned, the content moderation bits and the sort of long tail of that, what a media studies, industry studies approach could help with that. So that's something I've been grappling with too. So I look forward to reading the book. Thank you.
Can I get to Amanda Cody's question real quick, and then we can close maybe with the other one?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this doesn't help you with your situation. Amanda writes, my work background are in cultural studies, but I've moved into more traditional political economy. You use both terms when describing your book. My colleagues don't see these approaches as compatible, is the punchline. So this came up at one point in our research because I discovered that Eileen Meehan, who has written in the political economy vein for some time, big name there, I was digging into her dissertation, which served as one of her books, or the basis about the rating, television and ratings and things like that, measurement. And I emailed her and I said, so it looks like, and this is true, Thomas Guback was your chair on your dissertation, big name in political economy, inspired many people, as was Lawrence Grossberg. Right, so huge name in cultural studies. How did that committee get along? How did this happen? And she said, well, you know, at Champaign-Urbana, like there was this great thing happening in cultural studies. There was this other great thing happening in political economy. We just did our thing. We got along. And for the purposes of my project, I needed mentoring that talked about power operating in different arenas at different scales, something to that effect. And so the divisions between so-called cultural studies and political economy are perhaps more overstated now than they need to be, and then they were historically. Like we think of these origin stories of like there was the British cultural studies, and then there were these political economists, and they went to warfare. But according to Eileen Meehan, in any case, they were on the same dissertation committees and talking about power and capital and representation and all sorts of things. And so that's my answer to you, Amanda.
We have, and Amanda, this is again to be continued. And these are tricky things to negotiate in terms of the micropolitics of academic departments and so on. So that's perhaps a conversation we can continue down the road. Two other questions that have come up, and I'll just state them both and then we can see who wants to take them. One from Yuval Katz, a more general question about recommendations for a graduate student who wishes to sort of go down this road and think about media industries as their area of research. What are some of the key things we need to ask ourselves when we engage in such projects? What are good places to start? Well, I think this book is a good place to start, Yuval. I'd say that. But no, in all honesty, that was Yuval. The questions you raised, Yuval, were very much at the core of our thinking as we were writing this. This is very much designed to help anybody, an early career scholar, figure out where you fit in relation to a messy yet established formation, cutting across different media terrains, cutting across different regional contexts. So I'm sorry, yeah, I know that's not a satisfactory answer, Yuval, at the moment, but your question is really one for a seminar style sort of long-term discussion about what kinds of things you would start with when studying a media industry. But I'm sure Amanda and Dan might add to it. I'll just state the other question as well from Theo, who asks if you've encountered any contradictions when looking at site-specific local or regional work, specifically ethnography, issues of access to informants, participant observation, and so on, especially when embracing a post-national analytical outlook. Does post-national mean post-local? The answer to that is no. But you mentioned Caldwell at one point. How does your approach to production culture deal with some of the very particularly national and local contexts that do not easily apply from one context to another? I'm sure we can address that question, but Amanda, please.
To get back to Yuval, I think one thing that helped, I think it was when I was in graduate school, I started reading the trade press for the industry I was interested in, and I wasn't doing industry work at all at that point. But I mean, it was the process of and not just reading, I guess I don't even know how you reproduce this practice in a digital age, because this was clearly an analog age when broadcasting and cable literally arrived in my mailbox once a week, and I would read it cover to cover. And it was sort of, that was how I gained my familiarity with a lot of the industry dynamics. It became, I understood issues that I wouldn't have become aware of, I became aware of. And so I think that kind of reading, as opposed to doing searches on specific topics, gives you a breadth and appreciation of the dynamics of an industry, which, you know, I'd sort of say is a good place to start. Although I will acknowledge how much harder in many ways it is to do that in today's environment. I guess, and maybe in some ways it's easier because you can read you know, publications that would be difficult to receive in their hard copy. But I think reading the industry talk about itself is a good place to start.
Yeah, I would echo that. And the appendix in John Caldwell's production culture book is still an excellent place to start in terms of getting a sense of the incredible range of things that media industry themselves produce for themselves, for audiences sort of close to them, and for others who have nothing to do with the operations of the industries but are interested in them. To the second question, either one of you want to tackle that, or should I?
I think you
Yeah,
should.
I think a lot of that, I feel like Dan, you didn't talk about the production cultures chapter and the struggles therein, and so maybe that would be a good place to raise that. Okay,
I can talk about that. I can talk about the production cultures. I don't know that it's going to answer the question as posed perfectly, but you know, there was some debate among us all about what constituted a production culture study versus what constituted a study of an individual or role. And so, you know, that was a real debate. And I don't know that there's those chapters in terms of the case studies we talk about, sometimes they might be swappable. And so that kind of pulling those things apart was difficult or interesting in any way, in any case. And I think that, let's think. So there's the great book about European production cultures edited by Patrick Vonderow and others. There's that. I don't know that, and that really highlights, I think, let's say, and we don't talk about it much in our book, but that, as I recall, that collection highlights, for instance, how production cultures among workers on a public service broadcasting model really do work and think differently than people working in, you know, say Hollywood, you know, commodity production cinema. So that might be the beginning of the address. But I think for that chapter, thinking about, rather than just how does an individual serve an industrial role, but more how do they conceive of themselves? And so it's more like how do they create a life world and kind of internally produce themselves as working people. It's about the production of the culture of production, right? As opposed to the industrial function, right? And so this might be, and I think we say this at the intro of that. It's like a director, you might study a film director and like their career and what they did in the industry, but then to interview a bunch of directors and say, what does it mean to direct, and to kind of get inside the kind of thinking, the internal production of what a director thinks a director does and how they live, that's a different thing. Now, in terms of site specificity, you know, I think we looked at, I mean, obviously Caldwell's monograph is wide ranging, right? He talked to tons and tons of people and kind of provides this big lump of a portrait of production culture, whereas like Sherry Ortner's book about indie cinema just interviewed people who identified as working within indie cinema and based her interviews on that. And so comes up with a slightly different picture about what it means to work in the industry, because they are self-consciously defining their work as being in one sector of cinema, right? And so then she comes up with, well, these workers are politically motivated, or and so on, because that's like the discourse coming out of them. I know that I'm still in the North American context, probably only like 200 miles away from, like, say, Sundance to Los Angeles, but still, there's, even those two studies point to how different populations start to present themselves differently, and so, you know, the analysis follows.
I guess I'd add one or two things to that question about access, the question about post-national, stroke post-local, and so on. So I think it would be really nice to see more reflective sections about access methods and so on in dissertations and books. And articles are harder in terms of space, but in dissertations and books, it would be really nice to have scholars reflect deeply on their very specific paths and routes to gaining access not just to people and workspaces, but also access to documents, trade press documents, internal books that some companies open up to scholars and others do not, and so on. And that these questions are becoming, and these questions of access are becoming even harder to negotiate in the digital moment, as virtually every employee signs, I don't know how many non-disclosure agreements when they join in. That said, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that academics are in this in a more long-term sense than a journalist, right? So going back to what Amanda said about reading and keeping up with media industry's output about themselves, is also to try, I also think long-term in terms of cultivating connections. So many of the industry players are asking questions that we are asking, but their goals are slightly different. So as we cultivate connections, I think access does begin to open up in new and interesting ways over time. And then, of course, the more important bit is to think as a historian does, is to be patient, to wait for the kinds of materials that one might want to analyze a bit later. So in other words, presentist analysis only gets us so far in really grasping the dynamics of an institution or a production culture. And to your other question about post-national, post-local, absolutely not. Post-national does not mean post-local. And I think one of the limitations of the material we had to work with in terms of published scholarship is that we are only now beginning to learn about work that's coming out that genuinely decenters Hollywood. So there's one scholar on this call, a colleague of mine here at UVA, Samhita Sunya, whose work looks at film history, film culture, sound, and so on, but connects India to Lebanon, for instance, right? So there's a circuit that really those kinds of circuits we need to be paying much more attention to. So when we mean post-national, what we really ought to mean is thinking outside of these very established modes of what comparative work really means. And to bring in far more context into play might shed much more light on what an industry is and what it looks like, and what new questions might come up when the term industry does not mean what it does as Dan pointed out, in a Hollywood-style commodity production mode. I don't want to put Samhita on the spot, but if Samhita or any other film historians on this call, I see Devashree Mukherjee on here. If you would like to chime in, please do. But if not, no worries.
If I may just say one quick thing, this is Devashree. One of the things that really struck me in this conversation is the emphasis on thinking, as Aswin said, intersectorally. I mean, I think there's so much here in terms of what is the work of someone that calls themselves a media industry scholar. Where does the library that that scholar builds end? You know, and I think you're really pointing to some of those difficulties and urgencies of that. And I'm very, very excited to read this because I mean, I think a lot of these questions are going to become more urgent. For example, I'm thinking in my own work, what is this thing called industry? If we fixate on it, does it occlude some other questions? What if we were to think cinema alongside the cotton industry in Bombay, which then again makes you think very, very locally. So there is a site specificity there. And I'm very interested in the medium specificity question. And if you want to address that in some way, because you want to think what is the work that a cinema industry is doing in a time. But cinema itself is a concept and a practice that's evolving. So if you had something to say about that, I'd be very interested.
I mean, one thing I imagine is, again, at least from the production culture's angle, like you say, cinema is evolving, then it's a matter of like tracking how do the people who produce quote unquote cinema discursively produce cinema themselves in their rhetoric and in their daily lives. Like, what is cinema to the people who literally say, I work in film, I don't work in television, and things like that. I mean, that's a simplistic answer, and I'm sorry for that, but that would be where I go immediately to, off the top of my head.
Amanda, do you want to? Okay, thank you, Debashri. That was really helpful, and I think that's one of the things that we hope will get taken up, both in terms of historical work that's now beginning to come out, your own work, other scholars, but also the more contemporary work that graduate students and others are doing in relation to the digital as it's transforming screen industries across the world.
I mean, I guess to follow up in some ways, because the thing, like Sriram's question made me think, like, he asked the question, like, the slipperiness of a company that's a, media company, sometimes in a tech company, other times. I think if you're identifying yourself as doing media industry studies, then one of the questions is, how does claiming to be a tech company serve an industrial purpose, right? Because in the end, if you're doing media industry studies and not tech studies, then you study, like, how does the slipperiness function industrially? On the other hand, there's somebody like Ray Moores whose work is forcing her to do both digital media studies and media industry studies simultaneously because of the nature of the question. So that, and I think Aswin was pointing that to Sriram. And so I think with the question of like definition, I think it's like, well, what does it mean industrially to claim to be cinema? Like, what does that mean? Does it mean that you're not television? Does that mean that you make products in a certain format to certain markets for certain audiences? Or does it mean that you get to compete against some people and not others, right? There's all sorts of ways in which those issues of definition and self-definition are industrially produced and serve industrial purposes, perhaps deliberately, perhaps not deliberately. But I think those are the kinds of questions. Like, what does the discursive production of this category, what is it actually doing industrially?
Yeah, I just wanted to read out this comment from Debashri in case others have missed it, which is really great, which is, what does it mean to claim, in quote, cinema? And why do these claims become more strident at certain historical moments? See, for example, Mary Ann Doan's work. Yeah, absolutely agreed. And I think both your comment and question, Debashri, and Sriram's insistence on maintaining the distinction between a tech and media speaks to that. Is, I guess, one of the things we took away from Michelle Helms's sort of broad definition of what a critical media studies is of course inflected by Stuart Hall and other cultural studies work that insists on a conjunctural mode of analysis. So one of the things we've tried to do as we've captured other scholars' work, summarize them, thematize them, is to put them in context. Is why does this particular work happen when it does? And when it comes out, its reception and its take-up in other academic contexts is very much a contingent thing, is a historically specific thing. So it'll be interesting to see going forward how cognate disciplines, as they begin to engage with media and media industries, how these things shift and move. And we're already beginning to see that with some of the platform studies kind of work, which is media studies adjacent, but really works with a different set of scholarly literature. Management studies a bit more, economics certainly, media economics and so on. So it'll be interesting to see how that terrain evolves going forward. But yeah, thank you both of you for those reminders. Looking at my watch, and we're well into
Well past time.
an hour and 20 minutes. But I also, here we go. Right.
Thank you, everyone,
Yeah.
for tuning in wherever you are at whatever time it is. No,
It's
apologies,
It's
especially
early.
to U.S. West Coast.
For those of us who it's early, thank you. For those of you that it's late, thank you.
And we have recorded this. I will hopefully figure out a way to not lose the recording, and Polity will host it on their website and we can circulate it. And please do take advantage of the discount code, if not for yourself, certainly for your home institutions. If they're not under a financial freeze, hopefully it'll circulate. But if you have other questions, please direct them to Amanda. I'll post this back on Twitter at some point during the day, Amanda, and I'll do that. And yeah, thank you.
This has been a lot of
Tag
fun.
Aswin in the next few hours. I'll be back on in about 10 or so. Bedtime here.
I just want to say that it honestly, this was like writing this was just tons of fun. And so really everybody should try to collaborate if and when you can. And if you can, you should really collaborate with Aswin and Amanda because they're the best.
Thank you. And thank you once again to Ray for her incredible help with this book and the research. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.